Your ex-boyfriend to court to prove he fathered your 26-year-old daughter, Tanika. Denied her since birth because you were caught in a love triangle with him and his wife. Mr. Brown, you and your wife claim you can't be the father because of conception.
That's true, Your Honor.
You've basically taken care of your daughter alone. Your entire life, you were told that Mr. Brown was your biological father?
They told me different stories that he might not be my father, but my mother.
Cause my husband don't want her.
It's still going on.
She's still
for 26 years, it's still been going.
My husband don't want her.
I met him at the club, Your Honor. And when he left with his wife. He told me if she was just a friend. So he came back to the club.
That night?
That night. We danced, we partied, and then we went to the apartment. We was in the back of the room. She came in the door. She said, come on out, let me talk to you. She left, and then later on, we were still in the apartment. I didn't know that he was dating her because he...
Sometimes the truth doesn't heal. It breaks open decades of silence, destroys illusions, and forces every hidden wound into the light. When the DNA test becomes the final judge, people discover that truth changes everything, even love, loyalty, and the law itself. In this emotional courtroom, what began as a fight for $20,000 in child support becomes a masterclass in the fragile relationship between law and justice, where every answer carries the weight of memory, betrayal, and proof. There are stories where the courtroom becomes more than a stage for legal battles. It becomes a mirror of humanity itself. She says she's owed $20,000 in child support is one such story. At its surface, it's about a woman reopening an old child support case, demanding accountability from the man she believes fathered her daughter. But beneath that surface lies something far more profound: the search for identity, truth, and the eternal tug-of-war between emotion and evidence. For 26 years, denial, rumor, and silence stood in place of truth. The mother, convinced that the man she once loved is the biological father, carries not only the pain of unpaid support, but the emotional burden of raising a daughter in uncertainty. The father, unwavering in his denial, hides behind timelines, travel excuses, and the argument of impossibility. And between them stands the daughter, a grown woman still waiting for clarity about her bloodline. This is not just an episode. It's a living essay on the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where emotion demands what evidence must prove. In many cheating stories, we hear of betrayal between lovers, but in this case, betrayal echoes across generations. It's not merely infidelity of the body, it's a betrayal of truth, a refusal to face it. For years, both sides claim to have sought the DNA test, but like in so many people regret taking moments, fear delays justice. The truth is often avoided not because it is unclear, but because it is unbearable. And that is what this courtroom faces: the unbearable clarity of science against decades of human denial. When the case opens, the air itself seems to hold history. This is not the first hearing, not the first claim, and certainly not the first wound. The woman brings forward receipts, memories, and emotional evidence, each word laced with exhaustion. The man, flanked by his wife, defends not only himself but the narrative he has built for decades. His denial is polished, practiced. He insists he was away for 3 months during the time of conception. A classic adverse inference in Evidence Act scenario, where lack of cooperation becomes the most powerful evidence of all. But legal principles cannot fully describe what's unfolding here. This isn't merely the evidence stage in a divorce case. This is the evidence stage of life itself. Decades of anger, shame, and regret are on trial. As the discussion unfolds, both sides expose their deepest insecurities. The mother speaks of love and lies. The wife speaks of betrayal and humiliation. And the father, trapped between both women, swings between denial and defense, between the man he was and the man he pretends to be. The courtroom, in its quiet intensity, mirrors the philosophical relationship between law and justice. Law demands evidence, timelines, and signatures. Justice demands honesty, courage, and acknowledgement. Where law ends, humanity begins. That is what this case reveals, the difference between being right and being true. The Truth Changes Everything podcast once explored a phrase that fits perfectly here. The moment of truth doesn't destroy people, it exposes what was already broken. And that is precisely what the DNA test represents: exposure. It doesn't create division, it reveals it. The test becomes a silent witness, a symbol of accountability, and an unfeeling instrument that forces everyone to confront what they've avoided. Throughout the episode, echoes of the Game-Changing Attorney podcast can be heard, not literally but in spirit. It's about advocacy not just in the courtroom but in life. The power of evidence, the weight of denial, the way a signature, genuine or forged, can change the trajectory of an entire family. Legal experts could spend hours dissecting the adverse inference patterns, the contradictions in testimony, and the credibility of documents. But what makes this story unforgettable is not the legal intricacies. It's the human emotion pulsating beneath them. As the judge listens, her voice carries both authority and empathy. This isn't a moment for punishment, it's a moment for revelation. And revelation in this courtroom is sacred. The DNA test result, enclosed in a sealed envelope, becomes a metaphorical scripture, a modern truth tablet waiting to be read aloud. When it finally is, silence falls. Decades of doubt dissolve in one scientific statement. The man who denied, the woman who insisted, and the daughter who wondered all hear the truth at once. You are her father. Those 4 words rewrite 26 years of history. But in truth, they don't just close a case, they open a lifetime of reflection. The man breaks down, the daughter cries, the mother breathes a sigh that feels like release. For some, it's victory, for others, it's exposure. And yet, as the episode reminds us, truth is not revenge, it's redemption. This is where Celebrate Recovery testimonies come alive, not in church halls but in courtrooms. The act of facing the truth becomes the highest form of recovery. The daughter forgives her father before he even apologizes. That forgiveness is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's what separates bitterness from healing. Outside the courtroom, podcasts like the Divorce Course podcast often discuss how unresolved parenthood battles affect generations. This episode visualizes that pain. It shows how the absence of clarity becomes an inheritance of confusion. Children grow up not knowing who they are, not just legally, but emotionally. The law may resolve the issue of child support, but it cannot calculate the cost of emotional absence. In many ways, this is the courtroom version of Adoption Story's full episodes, except no one signed papers, no one went through agencies, and no one knew the truth. Yet the emotional landscape feels the same. A child searching for belonging, parents redefining themselves after the verdict. The invisible line between biology and love blurs. From a jurisprudence perspective, the case reflects how modern courts have evolved from pure legalism to psychological realism. Evidence no longer ends with documents. It includes memory, emotion, and silence. The concept of justice in jurisprudence has shifted from being about proof alone to being about truth in context. In the language of modern philosophy, this is restorative justice, not about who wins, but about who heals. This healing, however, isn't instant. The truth demands consequences. Now that the DNA confirms paternity, financial obligations under child support laws resurface. But the bigger question remains, can emotional debts be repaid? The Supreme Court may define fairness in legal terms, yet the heart defines it differently. Justice in law is about balance. Justice in life is about restoration. And that's the paradox of this episode. It's both a courtroom case and a human confession. Every participant becomes both witness and defendant. Every silence becomes evidence. Every tear becomes testimony. The audience, too, becomes part of this moral jury. We see how easily the law can be manipulated, how the justice system is often forced to choose between compassion and correctness. Yet, in the end, the DNA, the ultimate truth machine, restores balance. It's not about punishment, it's about peace. In the poetic sense, truth changes everything is more than a phrase. It's a verdict of the soul. It's what happens when denial finally meets evidence, when memory collides with science. People think they want answers until they realize answers come with accountability. The people regret taking DNA test stories that flood social media are often about this very moment, when knowing the truth doesn't bring relief, but responsibility. As the camera fades, the emotion lingers. The mother's relief, the daughter's tears, the father's quiet surrender all tell the same story, that justice is not a destination but a process. It begins not in court but in conscience. The courtroom becomes a confessional. The truth is not shouted. It is whispered, trembling through generations that never knew closure. When the DNA test results were read, the past did not vanish, it unfolded. The Truth Changes Everything podcast could have named this moment as one of those where science meets soul, where human frailty confronts divine mathematics. A single document held the power to undo decades of stories, rumors, and emotional scaffolding. For years, this family lived in competing narratives, each person believing their version was justice. But the relationship between law and justice is not symmetrical. It's messy, subjective, and deeply human. Law is about evidence. Justice is about meaning. Law measures facts. Justice measures impact. And here, both collided in the same courtroom. The mother's pain was not about the unpaid child support, not truly. It was about being disbelieved, dismissed, and left alone in her certainty. She carried her daughter's entire existence as an argument she could never conclusively win, a case that lived in her body. Her voice trembled not from anger, but from exhaustion. She had carried the emotional paperwork of proof for 26 years. On the other hand, the father's denial was not pure malice. It was fear disguised as logic. He had built his identity on a timeline he convinced himself was true. "I was on the road for 3 months," he repeated like a shield. But as in any evidence stage in a divorce case, what matters is not how rehearsed a story sounds, it's how it holds up against reality. And reality, unlike testimony, cannot be coached. His wife's defense was equally complex, part loyalty, part denial. She wasn't just defending her husband. She was defending the image of her marriage, the illusion of stability. In many cheating stories, it's not the affair that breaks the heart. It's the acknowledgement that love can be shared, divided, and returned incomplete. The wife wanted closure, but closure without truth is merely comfort built on fiction. The daughter stood at the emotional center, a silent observer who carried everyone's mistakes inside her name. For her, the courtroom wasn't about law, it was about belonging. The concept of justice in jurisprudence meets its purest form when viewed through her eyes, justice as acknowledgement, as validation. She wasn't looking for compensation or correction. She was looking for recognition, the right to know who she truly was. The case then takes a deeper philosophical turn. As the judge reads through documents, signatures disputed, papers forged or forgotten, the conversation drifts into a subtle legal reflection. It becomes a living example of how adverse inference in Evidence Act operates, where one party's refusal to provide clarity becomes its own form of proof. In the absence of cooperation, silence becomes evidence. Avoidance becomes confession. And yet, there's something beautifully tragic about this principle. It mirrors life itself. How many of us avoid our own truths, not because we're guilty, but because we're afraid of what admission will change? As the Game Changing Attorney podcast often explores, Sometimes justice isn't about who's right, but about who's willing to face the truth without flinching. In one of the quiet moments after the verdict, the judge's words carry the tone of spiritual counsel rather than judicial instruction. She reminds everyone, and us, that truth does not destroy, it clarifies. In that single statement, the entire courtroom shifts from adversarial combat to communal healing. The father, shaken by the revelation that he is indeed the biological parent, looks toward the daughter, a mix of guilt, surprise, and fragile affection. He reaches out. The daughter, hesitant but hopeful, accepts the gesture. And in that second, justice leaves the pages of the law and enters the heart. It's here that the Celebrate Recovery testimony's theme emerges powerfully, not as religious preaching but as emotional redemption. The courtroom becomes a sanctuary of confession, forgiveness, and renewal. The act of knowing, of finally acknowledging the truth, becomes sacred. These are the moments the law can't script but must allow. And yet behind this redemption lies a sobering question. How many lives are trapped in unresolved truths because they fear the DNA test? The science is neutral, but the implications are never simple. The results can rebuild families or tear them apart. As countless people regret taking stories online reveal, knowing the truth comes with a price. But the higher cost is in not knowing at all. This is why this episode transcends television. It becomes a study in human jurisprudence. In classical philosophy, justice was described as giving each their due. But what is due to a daughter who waited 26 years to be believed? What is due to a father who must now face both legal and moral debt? And what is due to a mother who never stopped fighting, not for money, but for truth? The Supreme Court often debates abstract doctrines like parental rights, burden of proof, and equitable enforcement. But in rooms like this, smaller, rawer, more human, those doctrines become faces, voices, and trembling hands. The relationship between law and justice is no longer academic, it's breathing. The law provides the structure, but justice provides the soul. In many ways, this episode echoes the Divorce Course podcast, where broken relationships meet the cold machinery of legal systems. But what stands out here is how the machinery bends just a little to accommodate the emotional truths that cannot fit neatly into statutes. When the mother speaks, it's not in legal jargon, it's in memory. When the daughter cries, it's not for a verdict, it's for a lifetime of lost acknowledgement. And when the father admits his mistake, it's not to the court, it's to himself. Some might call this melodrama, but within it lies an authentic reflection of justice, that real verdicts happen not in the mouth, but in the conscience. The Truth Changes Everything podcast once featured an attorney who said, "The courtroom isn't about winners, it's about survivors." Watching this episode, that line feels prophetic. The second part of the episode transitions into another family's turmoil, different names, same themes. A woman defending her son's paternity, a man doubting it, a landlord, a timeline, a question of fidelity. The specifics change, but the essence remains: love, suspicion, proof. Again, the DNA test becomes the ultimate arbiter. The story folds into a broader reflection. How trust collapses under the weight of assumption, how insecurity distorts perception, and how science becomes the reluctant savior of relationships. When the judge reads the results, "You are the father," relief floods the room, yet the relief is bittersweet. For both sides, knowing means reckoning. The man's doubts dissolve, but so do his excuses. The woman's vindication comes, but so does the awareness of how much pain was created in the waiting. Justice, again, feels both victorious and tragic. This duality defines the concept of justice in jurisprudence, that truth is not about comfort but about correction. And correction always hurts. Every courtroom drama hides a universal truth, that justice requires exposure. People must undress their lies, their fears, their protective narratives, and in doing so, they rediscover their humanity. If this were part of Adoption Story's full episodes, the narrative would be familiar: identity lost, identity found. But what makes this story more poignant is that no one was adopted, and yet everyone was estranged from one another and from themselves. The child estranged from her father, the father estranged from his own truth, the mother estranged from peace. In another layer, the episode also explores a modern ethical dilemma: the line between private truth and public record. The adverse inference in Evidence Act principle implies that failure to produce evidence can itself infer guilt. In this emotional ecosystem, avoidance of the DNA test became not just legal avoidance but moral evasion. Every missed appointment was another year stolen from the child's clarity. Every refusal was an act of quiet cruelty disguised as caution. Yet, as the judge reminds the courtroom, truth is patient. It waits for courage to catch up. The Celebrate Recovery testimony's essence reappears here, that no one is too broken for redemption, but redemption requires honesty. The father's eventual acceptance is the turning point. It's not about whether he pays child support or not. It's about whether he learns to emotionally support the child he denied. And that's the silent thesis of this episode. Financial restitution cannot heal emotional deprivation. Money can be counted. Absence cannot. This is where law meets philosophy. The relationship between law and justice is tested when the law can only fix part of what was broken. At times, the judge's tone resembles that of a teacher, a counselor, and a philosopher combined. She speaks of legacy, how the patterns of silence, denial, and shame repeat across generations. She points out that the daughter's tears are not just for herself, but for every child who grows up hearing conflicting stories about where they come from. The Truth Changes Everything podcast theme echoes again. The moment you know, you begin to heal. The man, once defensive, now quiet, nods. His wife, who spent years defending the wrong truth, lowers her eyes. The mother, vindicated but weary, sits still, her triumph tinged with melancholy. And the daughter, the true plaintiff of the soul, wipes her tears and says, "I forgave you long ago." That single sentence transforms the entire courtroom atmosphere. Forgiveness becomes the final verdict, not declared by the judge, but by the child. This is where the Celebrate Recovery testimonies converge with the game-changing attorney mindset. The law may enforce obligations, but only truth enforces healing. Justice here is not just a verdict, it's a confession, a hug, a pause after decades of noise. By the end of this act, one realizes that the DNA test, often feared, is not the destroyer of families but their last hope for unity. It is both the sword and the bridge. It cuts through lies, but it also connects what's real. And though people regret taking DNA tests when they expose painful realities, no one truly regrets knowing who they are. When the credits of the courtroom fade, what remains is silence, not empty but full. The silence of truth finally spoken. The silence of pain finally shared. The silence of justice, not imposed but accepted. This episode is not about scandal, it's about closure. It's about what happens when the search for truth outlives the will to deny it. It's a living testament that justice, in its purest form, is not retribution, it's revelation. When the courtroom lights dim and the audience fades, what lingers isn't the verdict, it's the quiet aftermath of truth. The human heart, stripped of denial, is left with only reflection. She says she's owed $20,000 in child support. Ends not as a story about law, but as an allegory about truth, the kind that transforms, unsettles, and ultimately redeems. The Truth Changes Everything podcast once said, "We think justice is about rules, but it's really about reconciliation." That's exactly what unfolds here. The final chapter of this episode transforms the courtroom from a battleground into a sanctuary, a place where everyone who spent years defending themselves finally learns that truth doesn't need defense, only acceptance. The daughter's face, calm yet trembling, becomes the living symbol of justice fulfilled. She is no longer a question mark between two adults' pride. She is a statement, clear, verified, undeniable. The DNA test, which had hovered over her entire life like a shadow, now shines like a light. It does not erase her pain, but it defines her reality. And in that definition lies peace. The mother exhales decades of bitterness. She had carried the emotional weight of unpaid child support, the humiliation of disbelief, the isolation of motherhood without recognition. Yet in the end, what she receives is more than money, it's validation. The acknowledgement that she was never lying, that her truth was worth the fight. Her tears in this moment are not of revenge, they are of relief. She finally belongs to her own story again. The father's realization is slower, heavier, and infinitely more complex. He stands before the truth that refuses to bend to excuses. For years, he trusted his own memory more than facts, his fear more than evidence. But now, faced with irrefutable science, he must confront the version of himself that denied, escaped, and deflected. The adverse inference in Evidence Act principle takes human form in his silence, a man whose years of avoidance have now testified against him. Yet within that silence, something divine happens, remorse. And remorse is often the beginning of justice. Justice, as the concept of jurisprudence teaches, is not about punishment alone, it's about moral equilibrium. The father, in his quiet tears, restores that balance. When he walks toward his daughter, not as a defendant but as a parent, the courtroom transforms into something higher, a space of redemption. His embrace is